All right, so we left off last class talking about all the different support cells in our nervous system. So we had talked about Schwann cells that are going to form sort of these protective coverings around our nerve fibers. These ones are specifically in the peripheral nervous system. So think of it like a cord for your electronics. You're not going to see unless you're, breaking your charger. There's a protective wrapping over them, so you're not going to see the wires. It's the same sort of function the myelin sheath provides for our neurons. All right. We also talked about the difference between our sensory division and our motor division, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, and so on. So today we are going to be talking about the main cells in our nervous system. So those are our neurons. Okay, neurons are the same thing as nerve cells, so you will hear me use those two terms all the time. These are specialized to transmit messages. And we've got a few regions of neurons. The two main ones are the cell body, which kind of looks like the head of the neuron, and then the processes, which extend from the cell body. They kind of look like a branch, or even branching off into little fingers. So this is what it looks like, and this is an illustration here. All right, so we can see here the head of it is our cell body. That's where we've got our nucleus, and we have our mitochondria, among other things. Then we can see the processes, which are branching off into our different terminals. That allows for us to send messages and receive messages. So within the cell body itself, so again, this part right here, we've got our Nissl substance, which is basically the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but just a little bit more specialized for our neuron. We've got our neurofibrils. So neuro is neuron, fibrils, think fibers. So these are actually very sturdy structures that maintain the cell's shape. So the cell in this case is not, an amoeba or has no shape. It has to keep its certain structure, and it does that through those neurofibrils, which is basically, in this case, the cell's skeleton. So again, we can see here in our cell body, we've got our very large nucleus, and we also have a nucleolus, which is in the center of our nucleus. So the nucleolus, that function of that organelle is to produce ribosomes. So cell body, again, think of that kind of like the head of the neuron. Now, for the extensions, okay, so we've got some extensions right around the cell body that are known as dendrites. So they're going to conduct the impulses towards the cell body. So that means this is where the cell body receives impulses. So to me, it kind of looks like hair, almost like if you ever watched Rugrats. I know that was a big part of my childhood. You had Cynthia, that doll that Angelica had. The hair for Cynthia kind of reminds me of these dendrites coming off of the cell body, because it's kind of branching and that kind of thing. So this is where our neurons receive the impulses, and then by traveling along the axons, which are these much longer branching off parts where we see the myelin sheath occurring, this is where they're sending impulses. So they receive the messages up here, and if they have to send a message, they send it along the axon terminals. So dendrites receive the message for the cell body, axons are going to send a message away from the cell body. So some information about our axons. So our axons allow for us to have nerve impulses, to have these responses to our environment. So axons are going to end in axonal terminals. All right, so a lot of times people think terminals like the terminals of an airport or that kind of thing. In this case, we're defining terminal as an endpoint. It's kind of depressing, but kind of like how if someone's got really late stage cancer or a terminal illness, that means that that's going to end up, killing that person. So it'll be the end. So the axons end in axonal terminals. So these end points. They're going to contain vesicles, which are these little packages. And these have neurotransmitters. This is used to send information from one neuron to another. And kind of like how our nerve cells never physically touch our muscle cells, we still have a gap there. So those nerve cells are not going to be physically touching each other. There is going to be a gap that allows for the passage of those neurotransmitters. So the gap is referred to as the synaptic cleft, and a synapse is a junction between nerves. So again, as we look at the basic structure of our neuron, we would see what kind of reminded me of those really puffy jackets. So those are the myelin sheaths. In the peripheral nervous system, this is produced by the Schwann cells. And it's done in this jelly roll fashion, which I think is funny. So basically it rolls up around the neuron. All right, so we've got our axon, so that very long part of the neuron in order to send out signals. And the Schwann cell is going to basically produce this wrapping that rolls it up like a jelly roll, or like one of those Swiss cake rolls, that kind of thing. Since I don't know how many of you have actually had a jelly roll, but I know I've had one of those little Swiss cake rolls, that's for sure. So I just think that's really cool, that it's not just a covering, but it's kind of like it wrapped it up in a blanket. Look, it does look like a pig in the blanket. A little bit. Maybe more like a noodle in a blanket, which that does not sound very tasty, but a little bit, yeah. All right, so where we find our neurons, most of the time this is going to be found in the central nervous system. So those neurons are wrapped in myelin sheaths from the oligodendrocytes. So in the gray matter, however, we've got our cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. Okay, that means they don't have the wrapping. Okay, the gray matter, that's found in the cerebrum, and also the nuclei. So happens where we have the white matter of the central nervous system. And so if you think about it, the white matter, that's where you just have a lot of those cell bodies or those heads of the neurons kind of clustered all together. And whatever is outside of our central nervous system, when we've got those collections again of those cell bodies, that's referred to as ganglia. So nervous system has a lot of really odd terms, I have to admit. Just a little quick kind of review on something we mentioned last class. So remember, we have separate divisions in the way that our body responds. So we've got, remember, our sensory division, where we receive the impulses from the peripheral nervous system and it delivers that to the central nervous system, whereas the motor division, once the impulses are received from the central nervous system, it sends the information to the peripherals in order to produce a movement. So we have specialized neurons for those divisions. So the sensory neurons are going to carry the impulses from the sensory receptors. A lot of times this is our touch receptors. So that's found, when they say cutaneous sense organs, they're talking about the sensory receptors on our skin. And we also have our proprioceptors, which are going to detect sort of a stretching or a tension. So that's something you don't really think about a lot of times, that you can detect when there is a stretch that's occurring, with your body, and also, specifically with your skin. You can feel it kind of being stretched out, or if you bend it a certain way, along the joints, you can feel that pulling on your skin. So that again happens peripheral nervous system, so to the side. It's going to carry the information to the central nervous system in the center of our body. Then once it receives the information, those motor neurons are then going to carry the impulses from our central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system. So this is just how our body is going to respond. It starts with the sensory, and then we get the motor response. So we also have these kind of intermediate neurons, sometimes referred to as association neurons or interneurons. And this is connecting those sensory and motor neurons. So this is kind of like just a connection, a little chain that's holding those two things together. They're found in the neural pathways in our central nervous system. So we're not going to discuss these too much. Just know that they exist. So again, kind of going along with that flow chart where we had the sensory division with the blue arrow, and we had the motor division with the red arrow. Over here, we've got those dendrites that are receiving information, and it is going to be delivering that from the peripheral into our central nervous system. Then let's say, for example, it's because my pain receptors, sent an impulse because I put my hand down on a thumbtack or something. And so that information of pain travels from the peripheral to the central. Then my brain's going to send a motor response that's going to make me move my hand. And so that is following this red here, where we've got, again, sensory in blue. Then the motor response goes out in red. Now, we can say that with a lot of our neurons, that we refer to them as multipolar, which means that they've got a lot of separate extensions from the cell body. So when you think of things like poles, think of them kind of like ends or projections. So multipolar means has many extensions coming off of the cell body. We also have bipolar neurons. Now this has nothing to do with bipolar disorder. Okay, nothing to do with that. If we break this down, bi means two, and then polar, think again, ends. So with our cell body in the middle here, we've got one dendrite, so that is one pole, and then we've got one axon, which is the other. So we have two poles or two ends or branching off points in the neuron. And finally, you have unipolar neurons. They have a single process leaving the cell body. So here, even though this has, some different ends here, it is coming from one point. All right, so zoom in, we can see this single process here that is coming off of the cell body, whereas we had our cell body here and we had two processes coming off of it. Or going even further back to multipolar, we had our cell body here and multiple processes coming off. So it's about the number of extensions that are coming off of that cell body. So again, here there is a single process or a single part coming off of the cell body that is then, going into the dendrites and that kind of thing. So we've got multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar neurons. All right, so that is where we're going to end the notes for today. So I'm going to stop recording.